This is Stockwell Green, and as you can see, green curves to the right there until at the end it just takes a quick left turn into Stockwell Road. And if we turn left, we'll see this is also Stockwell Green, curving to the left until that meets Stockwell Road. And if we turn all the way around, there's even a little bit of Stockwell Green behind us. It's also Stockwell Green up to the church where Lingham Road comes in from the right. The continuation of the road from where the blue car so conveniently stopped, that's Landor Road that runs fairly straight all the way up to Clapham North Tube. We'll see it on a map. I was standing about here taking that little film. This is Stockwell Road. Heading up that way for a few minutes would take you to Stockwell Underground, and coming down here, a few minutes walk would take you to Brixton Road opposite the Brixton Police Station. The numbering in Stockwell Green seems odd, as well as the road layout. Number 1's up here near the junction, and when there were houses here, 2, 3, 4, 5, the numbering ran down here, then crossed the road and came back along here, the 20s, the 30s, top number here something like 37, and then it crosses the road again, and the numbering runs back this way, 42, 54, back up here, and the top number in the green is 60, almost opposite number 1. And it still confuses many a delivery driver. It all makes sense when you see an old map. This is the Ordnance Survey 1871, and you see that the two arms of Stockwell Green and Stockwell Road contain the village green. The only houses were around the edge of the green, and so they were numbered consecutively round there and back again. When the green was built over, they had to carry the numbering on back and round. It makes sense. What did it look like then? Well, here's a view thanks to Lambeth Archives. We're standing in Stockwell Road, looking across to the long arm of Stockwell Green, the first bit that you saw. All those houses are still there today. I can assure you of that, because I'm sitting in one of them talking to you, which does seem a little odd. This arm of Stockwell Green has completely altered. That's a brewery which is long gone, and which we'll talk about later. The church is sort of tucked away around the corner, you can't see it, and you see all this rather dilapidated fencing. But how did it get built over? Wasn't it a village green? How did they do that? Why did they want to, did anyone want to build over it? Well, the simple reason of why, it was all the fault of the London Chatham and Dover Railway. The line came through Brixton in 1862, a station opened. And for those of you that know Brixton, a branch line was added soon afterwards. That's where you've got that sort of triangular piece of space between the lines down at Pope's Road. And then a few years later, the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway got into the act with the high level line that flies over the top. And as happened everywhere when the railways arrived, you got a population boom. And the population of the area, there's a convenient census in 1861, just before the start of the railway era here, and you can see that in just 20 years the population of Brixton more than trebled, and of course there was the concomitant house building that went with it. And so, you know, Stockwell Green, that had been a bit of wasteland, has now got building potential, and it's very potentially very valuable. But even so, how was it built over? Basically, a man called Honey bought Stockwell Green from the owners, which was the Manor of Stockwell, and was going to build on it. The local people got word of this and started a court action led by a man called Hamerton, who was a local big businessman, and we'll hear more about him later. And so this started a legal action called Hamerton versus Honey, a very significant case that was heard before the Master of the Rolls. And the locals made a claim that, to read a little bit of it to you, the plaintiffs and other inhabitants of the hamlet of Stockwell were entitled to use and enjoy a green called Stockwell Green as a place of recreation and amusement for air and exercise and for the playing of all manner of lawful games. Problem was, when they gave their evidence, they couldn't show that that's actually what they'd done. In fact, they showed quite successfully that early on the green had been open to anybody and everybody to do anything they liked. And it certainly wasn't being under any sort of control or use of the inhabitants or reserved for them in any way. Local stonemason would get out there and use it as an outside yard and do work. Travellers would come up and park their caravans, much to local dismay. It got used for all sorts of things. And 20 years earlier, one of the locals obtained a lease on the green and fenced it in. You saw some fencing on that earlier picture. Fenced it all in. As a result, it stopped all those what the locals regarded as nefarious activities, but it stopped all sorts of activities. Children may have still climbed over to play, but fundamentally it was quite clear that the green wasn't being used for recreation and amusement and playing lawful games at all. And so the judge had no difficulty in dismissing the case. Now, the case of Hamerton versus Honey was extremely significant, and despite changes to the law since, the Commons Registration Act, for instance, and the Commons Act reasonably recently, Hamerton versus Honey is still quoted in court cases as a means of determining whether a place is a green or not. The most recent case I found, you can see just on your screens there, was as recently as 2011. This court case was still being cited. This is how you decide whether something is or is not a village green. So that's how the green was lost and was built over. And we go back just to this map, just to show you our walking route. I'm going to start over here at number 1 Stockwell Green, cross the road onto Stockwell Road, come down Stockwell Road, walk through Stockwell Green Court, which is not well shown on this map, but you'll see it later. We'll see the mosque, come round the end here of Drayman's Court, down Combermere Road, look at this rather splendid pub on the corner, back up Dalio Road where we'll see the church, and back into Stockwell Green, the church, and here was where that brewery was you saw on that earlier photograph. So we start at number 1 Stockwell Green. Listed grade 2, built in 1848 in Jacobean style as an educational institute. I'm not reading out the rest of the listing details. I put them up there just for people to see if you have never looked at a listing, the detail they go into about its architectural state. It's fairly tall, the road's quite narrow, and it's difficult to stand and see actually in Stockwell Green and indeed photograph. It's rather easier to see if you go back across Stockwell Road and look back. The pub, by the way, the closed pub, classic 1930s Truman's, designed by their in-house architect, a man called Sewell. We'll come back to that in a minute. But we're looking at the school there, or it was built as a school. And the lack of educational provision for children in England in the early 1800s led to the formation of 2 societies. In 1811, the National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Church of England was formed. In 1814, the British and Foreign School Society for the Education of the Labouring and Manufacturing Classes of Society of every religious persuasion. That emerged from an earlier society in Lancaster. They're going for pithy names, didn't they? So essentially the first promoted C of E schools and the other nonconformists. This was built by the local congregational chapel that we'll see in a minute. It was a very well regarded school, but the costs, the drain on chapel resources and so on, it only lasted about 40 years. By then you'd got other education acts and the start of state education, and it certainly saw off this school. Today the building, as I say, it's listed and it is used by a charity supporting the homeless called Thames Reach. So I said I'd say a bit more. Oh no, first of all, I'm just going to take you back to this earlier map. Notice here, number 1 described as the British school, and over here a national school. That's why I read out those long-winded titles. This is the Nonconformist. This is the Church of England. This is St Andrew's Primary School. It's still there today. Been there over 200 years. We don't take it in on the walk. It's not worth the detour to see because it's not the original building. It's a very modern building today. But still, that C of E primary school is there. But yeah, I said I'd talk a bit more about the pub. It was called The Plough, and this is the cover of a CD, obviously. For a long time, starting in the 60s, it was a very well-known jazz music venue. This CD is of compositions by somebody called John Stevens, who I gather jazz fans will know. Recorded live at the Plough on the 4th of August 1978, still seems to be available. So it was very well known for that, and that carried on for a long time, but eventually it sort of died out there. And in the 90s, they reinvented the pub, or tried to, as a disco pub, renamed it The Plug, and you know, well, somebody pulled the plug. It was not a success, and it finally closed in 2001. Now the upper floors are flats, and the ground floor is in business occupation. So we're not going to get the pub back. We now walk along Stockwell Road and we see a uniform terrace of houses of the 1880s following Honey's building programme. Well, not totally uniform. You'll see the one in the middle stands out a bit. This is locally listed, a grander centrepiece of a row of terrace houses. Yeah, it was grander because the builder built it for himself, for his own occupation. And this was a builder with the splendidly named Mr. Cobbledick. Honest, I mean, I've got that on the best authority. We move on to Stockwell Green Court. This little alleyway is quite historically important. Sadly, you know, gets lots of fly tipping, although not much the day I photographed this, just the graffiti. The only reason it wasn't built over by Honey and his cohorts was that it was a right-of-way, which wasn't extinguished by the court action. And it gives us a good excuse to look back at another old photograph of the green. The first one you saw was looking in this direction across the green from Stockwell Road to these houses. This is looking from the short arm of Stockwell Green back. That is Stockwell Road. But you can see clearly the fencing there, and right across the middle of it, a fenced off footpath. And that is still the route of Stockwell Green Court between all the buildings. So it brings you out over here, where we're going to see the Congregational Chapel. You can't see it in this photo because it's set well back from the road down a courtyard. This is taken standing in the courtyard. This opened in 1798 originally as Stockwell New Chapel. It was a congregational chapel. It was enlarged and reopened in 1850. One famous person there in 1855, William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, was married. In 1972, of course, it morphed into the United Reformed Church. In 81, it was listed. Quite bizarrely, we're in the courtyard, so behind us are the gates and pillars that lead into the courtyard. And in 1981, English Heritage then listed both the chapel and the gates and pillars, their separate listings. But the chapel suffered from, diminishing congregation. In 87, it was sold up and bought by an Islamic group, and is now a mosque and an Islamic centre. The congregation temporarily worshipped at St Andrews, and they currently have a building at 6068 Stockwell Road. Where we were seeing that corner view of the pub, a little way down the road on the right, you could have seen, perhaps not in that picture, a quite modern building with a little day nursery, and that's where the United Reformed Church is today. So they're still happily around. So we walk along to the end of Stockwell Green now. Where's my map? There's Stockwell Green, and the entrance to the what's now the mosque is about here, where that scaffolding is up. Some work going on next door, and this is Drayman's Court. Of course, a dray was the old cart horse on which beer was delivered by Drayman, and the name echoes the earlier use of the site. Okay, I took the photograph when the tree was in full leaf, so you can't see the front, but it obviously very much mirrors the side, so you're not missing much. But at least it's not a hideous tower block. We can say that for it. This is what used to be here, Waltham's Brewery. Originally a Rhodes Brewery, and I can't trace back how far that goes, but we know that was bought by the Waltham brothers in 1851. So it became Waltham's Brewery, sometimes known as the Half Guinea Ale Brewery, one of their more famous brews that they advertised. So again, here's Stockwell Green going this way. Later, it was bought by the Lion Brewery in 1906, so it functioned as Waltham's for over half a century. The Lion Brewery itself is quite interesting, nothing to do with us locally, but it was based on the south bank of the river, huge building with a big model lion on top of it overlooking the river. That failed in the 30s, it was a fire there, and it remained either out of use or in minimal use for many years. After the war, it was taken down, and that is now the site where they built the Royal Festival Hall, all part of the Festival of Britain. Big lion on the top was saved and is on Westminster Bridge. So, you start locally and you find stories that take you elsewhere. Obviously, I can't vouch for the accuracy of this drawing. It was used by them on letterheads and so on, but some of it certainly survived into modern times. If you look at these sort of strong verticals here, and this bit next door, we'll now see a modern photograph. And there you see, that was pretty accurate in that engraving. This is all altered, and that's different. Some of it survived. You're seeing there in the distance the chapel, now a mosque. So this is the cover of a book by Sam Cornish, whom I met when he was doing his research, and I supplied him with some background information and a couple of images for the book, including the one that you can see. So 1967, the Summer of Love, the Monterey Pop Festival, the song San Francisco was written, called the unofficial anthem of the counterculture of the 1960s. And at this time, the depot that it had become was converted into a studio space by a group of young artists. You can see here what is probably an ambulance. As a depot, it was used for ambulances at one time, and later on for dust carts. So, as I say, Lambeth owned it, but they let these artists in. There were always painters involved, but the majority of people, what the depot is mostly remembered for, were sculptors. And what became known as Stockwell sculpture utilised very heavy steel elements welded to produce large abstract sculptures. And some of them became very well known. One, Peter Hyde, is professor and head of sculpture department at the University of Alberta, Canada, and he has work in many galleries, including the Tate Gallery. But after they left, after this era, and it became ever more run down, the site wasn't very secure and attracted a lot of antisocial behaviour. So as a result, there was no real local opposition to its demolition and the erection of those flats that you saw in about the year 2000. So we walk down this road now, and just on the corner there, you can see a pub. And this is the Marquis of Lorne, about 1880, listed grade 2 in 1981, really mainly because of the quality of the tile work, and you can see it there on the pub, but I've blown it up a little section here just to show you. It is quite glorious. Interesting stories. Named for John Campbell, son of the 8th Duke of Argyll, who had the title the Marquis of Lorne. That doesn't give you, doesn't make you a member of the House of Lords, the Marquis title, and indeed for some time he was actually an MP in the Commons. He was born in 1845, and in 1871 he married Princess Louise, the fourth daughter of Queen Victoria. This was the only second time in history that a royal princess had married someone who wasn't also of a royal family, someone who was actually a subject to the crown. The first time it had happened was when the first Duke of Suffolk married Mary Tudor, one of Henry VIII's daughters. So the Marquis and his wife, you know, they had a lot in common, their love of the arts and so on, but their marriage wasn't good, and they spent quite a lot of time apart. A number of his male friends were known to be gay even then, which obviously fueled rumours, but it's never been really established whether he was or not. But perhaps his most successful period was as Governor General of Canada from 1878 to 1883, where the couple helped establish the Royal Society of Canada, the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, and the National Gallery of Canada. So they're still well remembered there. And funny enough, he was succeeded by, as Governor General, by another Marquis, the Marquis of Lansdowne. And as we now move on and walk down Balliol Road towards Landor Road, we pass on the right, first of all, Lansdowne School, and then Argyll Close. So all three names are all linked in some way. And as we get down Balliol Road, we see the side elevation of St Andrew's Church there. We go around the corner and see it again from Stockwell Green. Now, the church was originally built as a chapel in 1767. And the impetus for this was that the good burghers of Stockwell were fed up with having to go all the way to St Mary Lambeth every Sunday. St Mary Lambeth, that's the building right next to Lambeth Palace, a medieval church which is no longer a church. It was deconsecrated and now houses the Splendid Garden Museum. But now that is not a church, St Andrews is the oldest church in the old parish of St Mary Lambeth. If you want to know how big that parish was, it was the original borough of Lambeth, or up until the 1965 reorganisation, or you could say today's borough of Lambeth minus Clapham and Streatham. It covered a very large area. And although it's been much altered since, of course, which we'll come to, it's still recognisable in the current building, like those 4 tall arch windows with smaller windows underneath. You saw them in that side elevation. But when the local people wanted to, we've still got people trying to join. When the local people wanted to have a chapel, the first question was where to build it. So this is one of the earliest reliable maps of the area, John Rock's map of 1746. You see here Clapham, Stockwell Green, a little bit of Loughborough Gardens, I think that is, Camberwell. Just down here, just off screen, is Dulwich. Where's Brixton? Well, there's Acre Lane, Cold Harbour Lane, Brixton Road, Brixton Hill. Not a house in sight. It hasn't got going yet at all. Now, that little corner is an obvious nice place for a chapel. Problem was, although Stockwell Green itself and this area was part of the manor of Stockwell, all of this land was owned by the Duke of Bedford estates. And which is why today, if you go to the end of Landor Road to Clapham North Tube and you turn left, you're in Bedford Road. So the secondary sources say that excuse me, you find people saying that you know, sorry, there's a bit of technical issues there. The secondary sources, such as the Survey of London, tell you that the land for the chapel was given by the Duke of Bedford. The story is much more complicated than that, and I find it quite interesting. Here's the Duke of Bedford at the relevant time, and we meet another Marquis, the Marquis of Tavistock. Now, as Duke in training, he's got 2 duties. The first thing he's got to do is to learn to manage a large estate, and the second thing he's got to do is to make sure there's a generation to follow him on. And to achieve the first part, he was actually owned part of the Bedford estate in his own name, in his own right, give him his own income. He married Elizabeth, and as you can see, that they had 2 children. He was actually the owner of that field on the corner that I pointed out on the earlier map, which was called Stackyard Field. And when the locals asked him if they could have space on the corner to build their chapel, he said yes. So they got on and built it. But if you followed these dates, and I'll point them out to you, in 1765, Elizabeth gave him a son, Francis. In 1766, she gave him another son, John. And in 1767, at the tender age of 28, Francis, Marquis of Tavistock, Upton died. So a family tragedy, but a real problem for the builders of the chapel, because they hadn't done any paperwork. They built it on the basis of his word, and there'd been no transfer of the land or any other documentation. And that land was now owned by this Francis, his son, his oldest son, who at that time was only sort of 2, and was Marquis of Tavistock. That created a big problem, and I found in the London Metropolitan Archives how it was solved. His guardians, his grandfather, the 4th Duke, and his widowed mother, Elizabeth, granted a lease of 21 years. And as it reads, His Grace the Duke of Bedford and the Most Honourable the Marchioness of Tavistock granted to the Reverend Bearley Porteous and others. It was a 21-year lease for a peppercorn rent, which means essentially it was free. And the document explains the circumstances of its creation, expresses the wish that the infant Francis will, when he gains his majority, when he's over 21, honour his late father's intentions. So we go forward 21 years, the lease is expiring, and the young Francis is now not only an adult, but is also the 5th Duke, his grandfather having died. Then I found in the National Archives at Kew a conveyance of 1788 in which the 5th Duke actually sold the land, but only for 10 shillings, to the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of Winchester, and the Rector of Lambeth, and their successors upon trust for use as a chapel of ease. Now you notice that the original intention and the original lease was to give the land to the local people, but when it was actually sold by the Duke, he gave it to all the Church of England bigwigs instead. Incidentally, 10 shillings, even in 1788, is a pretty nominal sum. It would be about £76 today. So perhaps it only paid for the drawing up of the deed. So that's the actual full story of how the land came to be given. And it just shows you that you're not going to get the full story unless you go back to original sources. So we're now going to jump forward, having taken a while over that whole century. Don't try and read the letter. I'll take you through it. Century later, the parish of St Mary Lambeth has been divided and subdivided as the population of the area has grown. And the church now wants to, the Church of England now wants to turn St Andrews from a chapel into a full-blown parish church. And they have a problem. It only seats 800. I mean, 800 today, how many churches would be delighted to fill 800 pews? But then, in the 1860s, this wasn't considered big enough for a parish church. Now, I discovered what their first plan was by just the most remarkable coincidence. I bought this letter from a well-known online auction site, as people say. And it's a letter dated the 16th of April, 1864, from Gray's Inn, one of the Inns of Court, major lawyers acting for the bishop to the Lord of the Manor. Well, it's not a lord at the moment, it's the widowed, the Lady Grant, who'd inherited what little was left of the Manor of Stockwell, most of it having been sold off much earlier, but she did own Stockwell Green, and so they asked her if she wouldn't mind giving them Stockwell Green to build the new parish church on. And a masterpiece of mistiming. 1864, the railway had opened in 1862, and by now it's already obvious that land everywhere nearby was going to be much more valuable. We don't have the actual reply from the Lady Grant, but we know what it was, and I'm sure she was very polite about it. So they had to turn to a plan B, which they did, and it's actually easiest to see in an aerial view, thanks to the marvellous Google map system. And what they did is they added a new bay on the side, rather awkwardly. Not the full length of the church with this gable roof. They added the bell tower, and inside they added a couple of galleries, and that increased the capacity of the church to 1,043, and so it was able to become a full parish. And you can see here this outline gives you still the original chapel. Unfortunately, this wasn't the end of changes. In the 1880s, the exterior was rendered, and that's proved a disaster. in 1924 that the side galleries were removed in further extensive restoration. So if we were there, I'm afraid we still couldn't go in because the church has been closed now for at least a couple of years, very badly neglected, so much so that it's become rather unsafe. Pieces started falling off the bell tower. You might have noticed in the earlier pictures covered in blue netting, and that's why. But among the things you would see inside, it doesn't look much outside, but inside this is the rose window. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John I've annotated, though fairly obvious. I don't know, I haven't found out from any research yet why the other four roundels were chosen: St Augustine, St Alban, Edward the Confessor and the Venerable Bede, but there you go. It really is nice with the sun shining through it. The other great thing in there is the World War I memorial. And it really does look this good because it's made of glazed ceramic tiles and they just don't fade. Now, I'm sure many of you know the big war memorial near Stockwell Tube Station, and there's a fantastic book by local author Naomi Klein in which she's listed every single name on that memorial and has short biographies of most of them. Fantastic piece of research. And very useful for me because I've been able to cross-check all the names on this memorial in the church against the big Stockwell War memorial quite easily. And quite a number of these names are on the Stockwell War memorial, but quite a number are not. So as far as we know, this is their only memorial. And so it's pretty important and significant. As I said, the church is in a bad way, and the new plan A of the church was to have a developer demolish it and the adjacent Hamilton Memorial Hall, which I haven't mentioned yet, build a new church on the corner with flats adjacent to pay for it all. Now the church is not listed. I actually tried to get it listed. And normally a building of 1767 vintage would be a shoe-in, but the later alterations have left it looking like at best a run-of-the-mill Victorian church, and they declined to list it. But it is locally listed. It is in a conservation area, and I gather that when Plan A was discussed with the Lambeth Planning Authority, it was roundly rejected. They didn't want to see the church demolished. So we don't know what Plan B is this time, but we do know that repair will be very expensive. Of course, times have moved on, and because of shrinking congregations, the opportunity was taken with the retirement of, I think it was the last vicar but two, to merge St Andrew's Parish with St Michael's, which is the other side of Stockwell Road, and they had their own church. It does mean the merged parish has a church open, but of course they've now got two church buildings to worry about. We move on to our last stop of the tour, Hamerton Brewery, but we can just pause again to look at the church. There's the tower. Here's this rather awkward extension put on the side, as you can see, and the rose window without the light, looking very dull. So this is the smart face of Hamerton's. This is the offices. The working building stretched back behind it down Lingham Street, as you see it here. It was formerly known as the Stockwell Brewery, and secondary sources say it dates from 1730. I've not been able to find a primary source to verify that. But on the other hand, I mean, it would be surprising if the village of Stockwell didn't have, at the very least, a brew house, probably going back for a very long time. The Hamerton family acquired it in 1874, and it was theirs then. Charles Hamerton died first of all, sorry, it was a family business. In 1902, Charles Hamerton turned it into a proper limited company. I haven't got to the bottom of it, but I suspect he may have known he wasn't well, because he died in October 1903. But having made it a company with shares, it made it easier for him to leave shares in trust for his widow, and he had 6 daughters. So the family name sort of, or that line of the family name died with them, but it remained with the company. And indeed, at least a couple of the daughters were married to brewers that were employed by the firm. So in a sense, it remained very much a family firm. Those daughters donated the Hamerton Memorial Hall to the parish in his memory in 1906. I haven't got a picture of it. You can only see it today sort of over the fencing. It's just down here on the left past the church. And again, it's been left in dilapidation like the church and is completely closed off today. In 1951, Hamerton's still going, but it was bought by Watney, Coombe and Reed. And it's pretty clear that more than anything else, they wanted the brands which were quite famous in those days. Hamerton's Oatmeal Stout. You can see there the metal street advert for Hamerton's Oatmeal Stout. And on the right, a beer label for their India Pale Ale. Notice the horse logo, the horse head logo that they adopted, called Stockwell. Well, there was a very famous and successful racehorse called Stockwell, and he was called Stockwell because he was bred on a stud farm that existed further up Landor Road. It sounds amazing today to think of a stud farm, you know, just off Landor Road. But when you look back to that old map, you know, before the coming of the railways, this was Surrey countryside, and a stud farm was established there, and Stockwell was bred there, was a very successful horse, and Hamerton's adopted it as a logo. Watney's, after the takeover, they kept advertising the brands. You can see here, Betty Hill have a Hamerton for Zest, and the IPA brand continued. But notice, if you read the small print, if you can see it on your screens, this was brewed at the Stag Brewery, London SW1. It wasn't brewed at Stockwell. That was the end of brewing at Stockwell. And it's actually the end of our walk, because if we were doing it for real, we would be back